The air in the hallway is thick, suffocating, like dust motes suspended in a sunbeam you can barely see in the perpetual twilight of this house. I press my ear to the study door, the cheap veneer cool against my skin. Inside, his voice. Low, choked, wet with tears I haven't seen him shed in years. Not for me anyway. Not for us. He's talking to her. It's killing me, Sarah. Just killing me, he rasps, a dramatic sigh following the words. The debt, it's crushing. I don't know how I'm going to make payroll next week. The suppliers are hounding me. This house, the mortgage, is astronomical. My breath catches, a sharp, silent intake of air that feels like swallowing glass. The mortgage, the payroll, the suppliers. He's laying it all out, his litany of financial woes, painting himself as the tortured, failing businessman. A portrait of a man at the end of his rope. A man who needs saving. A man who needs her. And I stand here, a ghost in my own home, listening to him spill his manufactured despair to the woman he's been screwing in motel rooms and whispering sweet nothings to behind my back. He complains about the mortgage on this house, the house I made the down payment on, the house I secretly paid the last 3 installments on when he suddenly couldn't find the money. He talks about payroll that only went through last month because I quietly transferred money from my private account, the one he doesn't know exists, directly into his business account, labeling it loan repayment from a fictitious client. He's crying to his mistress about the very problems I am solving, in secret, while he pretends to be struggling alone. It's not just betrayal anymore. It's a grotesque, offensive comedy. He's weeping into his phone about a burning building, oblivious that I'm the one inside, throwing water on the flames, singed and choking on the smoke, while he stands outside pointing and begging for sympathy from a stranger. He sniffles again. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, Sarah. The pressure, it's relentless. And Diana, he pauses, and I brace myself, knowing my name is about to be used as a convenient prop in his performance. Diana she doesn't understand. She lives in her own world. She doesn't see the struggle. My world. The world I built. The world I've quietly, methodically propped up for years. The world where his struggle is only a problem because his incompetence and lies have made it so, and because I haven't yet let it all crash down. He thinks I don't see the struggle? I live it. I breathe it. I am paying for it. A cold, hard knot forms in my stomach. It's not sadness. It's not even rage, not exactly. It's something sharper, cleaner. It's the feeling of a blade being sharpened on a whetstone, slow and deliberate. He's still talking, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper now. Sometimes I think, maybe she's holding me back. Maybe if I was free of all this, I could actually breathe. Build something real. Free of all this. Free of me. While I'm the one paying for the air he breathes, the roof over his head, the phone in his hand, he uses to tell another woman how much I'm dragging him down. The urge to burst through the door, to scream, to show him the bank statements I've collected, the canceled checks, the wire transfers, is almost unbearable. To shatter this pathetic performance with the brutal force of truth. But I don't. Not yet. The blade isn't sharp enough. Not yet. He wants to talk about struggle? He hasn't seen anything yet. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Our life together, before I knew, it wasn't a fairy tale. Nothing so shiny or simple. It was more like a comfortable chair. A bit worn around the edges, maybe a permanent stain or 2 on the cushion, but familiar. Predictable. Safe. We built it piece by piece, or so I thought. We met at a mutual friend's dreadful office party. He was charming, loud, full of big ideas. I was quiet, analytical, grounded. People said we balanced each other out. He had the vision, the charisma, the ability to walk into a room and command attention. I had the structure, the planning, the quiet persistence that actually made things happen. He wanted to start his own business. A bold move, a risk. I supported it. I worked my own steady, frankly dull, corporate job. It paid well. More than well enough. Enough to cover the lean years of his startup. Enough to make sure the mortgage got paid even when his accounts were empty. Enough to build a savings cushion for our future, I told myself. He talked about his business constantly, the potential deals, the investments, the inevitable success just around the corner. I listened, I nodded, I offered practical suggestions he usually ignored. I handled the household budget, paid the bills, managed our investments. He was the visionary, the face of the operation. I was the silent partner, the foundation no one saw, the scaffolding he built his dreams upon. He brought energy, laughter sometimes. I brought stability, reality. For a long time, I told myself it was enough. He needed me. He relied on me. That felt like love, or a version of it. He wasn't the most attentive husband. He was often preoccupied, stressed about work, or off networking. But he was present, mostly. We had routines. Sunday morning coffee, Friday night takeout. Small anchor points in a life that felt like it was constantly being swept along by his big ambitions. I was the quiet current beneath the surface, ensuring we didn't drift too far off course. I told myself this was my role, my value. Looking back, maybe the cracks were always there. His aversion to details. His tendency to overspend on potential clients, fancy lunches, the appearance of success, long before the success was real. His casual dismissal of budgets, his belief that it would all work out somehow. I just handled it. Tightened my own belt, worked a little harder, dipped into my savings. I saw it as temporary. The price of supporting a dream. His dream, which was also, by extension, supposed to be ours. The house we live in is lovely, objectively. 4 bedrooms, a small garden, in a good neighborhood. It felt like an achievement. Our achievement. Though, as he cried in the study, complaining about its cost, I remembered signing the bulk of the paperwork myself, the notary complimenting my organized file. I remembered the nervous knot in my stomach as I wired the down payment, a significant chunk of my life savings. He was out of town on a crucial business trip that week. Of course. His business did okay for a while. Enough to be plausible. Enough for him to talk about it with pride. Enough for people to nod and say he was doing well. But I saw the numbers. The erratic income. The mounting expenses. The way he'd suddenly need a large sum for something critical right before a bill was due. I always covered it. A quiet transfer. An unexpected bonus I decided to put towards the house. Small, seemingly innocuous acts of financial cushioning that became a habit. I was his hidden safety net, the one he didn't know he was bouncing on. My own career was progressing steadily. Not flashy, but secure. I made good money, saved diligently. I had my own financial goals, my own sense of security. I liked knowing I was independent, capable. I didn't need his money. I just needed him, or the idea of him, the idea of the life we were building. He started working later, traveling more. The stress, he said, the pressure of the business. I understood, or I told myself I did. I focused on my own work, on managing the household, on maintaining the comfortable chair. There were nights I went to bed alone. Mornings he was already gone. We talked less, laughed less. The silence in the house grew, filling the spaces where conversation used to be. I thought it was just the natural evolution of a long-term relationship, or the strain of his ambitious career. I was wrong. The inciting incident wasn't a single, dramatic discovery like finding lipstick on his collar or a scandalous text on his unlocked phone. It was messier, slower, like a creeping vine. It started with a stray email, a forward from his business account to his personal one, something he'd clearly meant to delete. It was a confirmation for a hotel room, dated a few weeks prior. Nothing incriminating on its own. A business trip, he'd said. But the location was wrong. He'd told me he was in Chicago. The hotel was in Detroit. A small inconsistency. Too small to confront him over, maybe. Just odd. Then, a few days later, his work phone, which he usually guarded like a state secret, buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. A text preview flashed on the screen. Can't wait to see you Friday. Everything okay? The name was Sarah. Just Sarah. No last name. No company affiliation. My stomach tightened. He was supposed to be working late on Friday. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone. I hated myself for doing it, for violating that boundary, but the cold dread was already spreading through me. I opened his messages. And there she was.
Sarah.
Pages and pages of messages. Pet names, inside jokes, declarations of missing each other, plans to meet. And intertwined with the sickeningly sweet exchanges, the complaints. About his work, about his stress, about his wife.
About me.
He painted a picture of a cold, unsupportive partner. A woman who didn't understand him, who didn't appreciate his struggles, who was obsessed with money and security while he was out there fighting for their future. The irony choked me. He was describing me as the problem, the barrier, the cold reality he had to escape from, while I was the one holding up the foundation he was standing on. And then I saw the financial messages. This wasn't just about emotional or physical betrayal. He was crying to her about money, asking for advice, sometimes hinting at his dire situation in a way that felt like a subtle plea for help. He was confiding in her about the very debts I was scrambling to pay off. He was sharing his struggles with her, presenting himself as a victim of circumstances, when his circumstances were largely a result of his own poor decisions and the fact that he didn't know how much I was actually doing. The pain of the affair was immense, a gut punch that left me breathless. But the calculated deception, the way he used my name, my life, my supposed lack of understanding as a reason for his misery, while secretly relying on my financial support, that was a different kind of wound. It was cold, strategic, humiliating. I didn't confront him.
Not then.
The initial shock froze me. I went through the motions, a zombie in my own life. I cooked dinner. I watched TV with him. I even slept in the same bed, though sleep was a distant memory. Inside, a storm raged.
Betrayal. Yes.
But also confusion. How could he be so clueless? Did he really think I didn't see the numbers? Did he think the bills paid themselves? Did he genuinely believe his own narrative of the struggling hero burdened by an unsupportive wife? The days blurred into a haze of forced smiles and silent screams. My office became my sanctuary. I buried myself in work, the structure and logic of my job a stark contrast to the chaos of my personal life. But the moment I was alone, the questions would flood in.
Why? How long?
And what now? I started doing things differently. Not out of anger, not initially. Out of a desperate need to understand the depth of the hole he'd dug and how it impacted me. I began scrutinizing our joint accounts, his business accounts, using passwords I knew or could guess, another layer of casual boundary crossing that now felt predatory. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd imagined. It wasn't just lean times. It was reckless spending, unpaid taxes, loans taken out that I knew nothing about, suppliers threatening legal action. He wasn't just struggling, he was drowning, and he was dragging me down with him, completely oblivious to the fact that I was his only life raft. I couldn't leave him immediately. Not just emotionally, but practically. Our finances were intertwined. His business debt, if it collapsed, could impact me. The house, though I'd paid heavily into it, was in both our names. I needed to untangle myself, to protect what was mine, before I could walk away. And the more I dug, the more I realized the extent of his delusion. He truly seemed to believe that his financial problems were external forces conspiring against him, or perhaps my fault for not being supportive enough, whatever that meant in his warped reality. He wasn't malicious, not in a cackling villain way. He was just profoundly self-absorbed and irresponsible. And he had seamlessly woven a narrative where he was the victim and I was the obstacle. The hardest part was maintaining the facade. Pretending everything was fine. Smiling when he came home late, smelling vaguely of cheap perfume and desperation. Listening to him complain about work, about money, about how hard things were, he would sigh dramatically, run a hand through his hair, look world-weary. And I would sit there, nodding, a stone inside my chest, knowing I had just paid his company's overdue utility bill that morning to prevent the power from being cut off. I started transferring money more frequently. Not to save him, not anymore. To protect myself. to prevent a complete financial meltdown that would devastate my own security. I paid off critical business debts, covered overdue taxes, settled supplier accounts. Each transaction was a small act of self-preservation and a quiet, bitter affirmation of his helplessness. I was his secret benefactor, keeping his flimsy house of cards from collapsing while he was out playing the tragic hero with his mistress. I also started gathering evidence. Quietly, methodically. Copies of the texts, screenshots of the emails with Sarah. Printouts of bank statements highlighting my transfers into his accounts, contrasted with his own dwindling balances. Loan documents he hadn't shown me. Tax notices stuffed at the bottom of his desk drawer. I created a digital archive, encrypted, backed up. A paper trail more powerful than emotions, more damning than any confession. The emotional toll was immense. The constant performance was exhausting. I felt like I was living two lives, the calm, competent woman everyone saw, and the seething, strategic stranger I had become. Sleep offered no respite. My nights were filled with restless tossing and turning, replaying conversations, planning my next move. My days were a blur of forced smiles, polite questions, and the cold, clinical task of cleaning up his financial mess while he was busy making a new one. He became bolder in his lies. He'd tell me he was working late, then I'd see a text from Sarah on his phone asking if he made it back okay from their weekend trip. He'd complain about not having enough money for a new suit for a big meeting, completely unaware that I had already transferred the exact amount he needed into his business account the day before. He was so caught up in his own narrative, so convinced of my ignorance, that he didn't see the quiet, deadly game I was playing. The mistress, Sarah, also became a more defined character in my hidden life. Through the texts and emails I saw, always careful to make it look like he'd left his screen open, I saw her sympathy, her encouragement, her belief in his struggle. I also saw her growing demands. She wasn't just a shoulder to cry on. She wanted things.
Gifts. Trips.
Promises of a future when he was free. It was clear she was buying into his victim narrative and saw herself as the rescuer, entitled to spoils. The thought of her reacting to the truth, that her struggling hero was actually a financially dependent liability propped up by the woman he was complaining about, became a source of grim satisfaction. There was one particularly difficult week. His biggest client threatened to pull their contract due to unpaid invoices. His business account was empty. He was in a panic, pacing the house, muttering about bankruptcy, about losing everything. He called Sarah, his voice trembling, begging her for advice, for reassurance. I listened from the next room, my heart pounding, partly with fear for our intertwined future, partly with a cold rage at his helplessness. He didn't even consider asking me. He just assumed I couldn't help or wouldn't understand. That night, from my hidden account, I paid the client's invoices in full. Over $50,000. Money I had worked years to save. It felt like ripping a piece of my soul out. But it secured the client, saved his business from immediate collapse, and added another heavy link to the chain I was building around him. I went to bed that night feeling hollowed out, but also strangely powerful. I had the ability to save or destroy him, and he had no idea. The strain was immense. I was constantly on edge, waiting for him to slip up, waiting for Sarah to demand something I couldn't cover, waiting for my own strength to break. I lost weight. My friends noticed. "You okay, Diana? You seem distant." I'd force a smile. "Just stressed with work," I'd say, the lies sliding out easily now. I was becoming adept at deception, a skill I never wanted to learn. The transformation from heartbroken wife to cold strategist felt complete. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had been compartmentalized, frozen into a hard core of resolve. My goal was no longer reconciliation, or even just escape. It was exposure, vindication. Not just leaving him, but ensuring that his carefully constructed world of lies collapsed around him, and that the people he had deceived, including his mistress, saw him for what he truly was. The midpoint shift wasn't a sudden event, but a gradual hardening. It was the accumulation of too many lies, too many secret payments, Too many overheard conversations where he painted me as the villain. It was the realization that he wasn't just having an affair, he was living a complete fantasy built on my hidden support. The sheer audacity of his deception, coupled with his utter financial incompetence, stripped away any lingering affection or pity I might have felt. It was replaced by a cold, clear determination. The plan crystallized. It wouldn't be a quiet departure. It wouldn't be a tearful confrontation. It would be a reveal. A performance designed to strip him bare, to expose his fraud not just to me, but to the person he sought solace and admiration from, his mistress. And I would use the very thing he complained about, the very thing I was hiding, his financial dependency, as the weapon. The timing was everything. It had to be when he was feeling most confident in his victim narrative, most secure in his connection with Sarah. It had to be when the evidence was undeniable, when the impact would be most devastating. I started thinking about locations. Our house? Too private, too messy. His office? Too public, potentially legally complicated. A neutral ground. I decided on a place he felt comfortable, a place where he often met with Sarah. A quiet cafe downtown, one with discreet corners. I knew his habits, his schedule. I knew when he usually met her. I would arrange to be there, seemingly by chance. The weeks leading up to the chosen date were a blur of final preparations. I organized my finances completely, separate accounts, assets transferred into trusts, consultations with a lawyer who specialized in complex divorces, telling him it was a precautionary measure for business partners, another lie. I finalized the evidence file, printing multiple copies, highlighting the key transactions, annotating the messages. It felt like preparing for war. And, in a way, it was. The emotional burden was immense. The constant fear of being discovered, of slipping up. The sheer exhaustion of living a lie. There were days I just wanted to curl up and disappear. But the cold, hard resolve held me together. I reminded myself of the overheard conversations, of the money I'd poured into his sinking ship, of the humiliation of being the unseen prop in his pathetic drama. That fueled me. He was completely oblivious. He was actually lighter, happier, in the days leading up to the date I had set. Sarah, it seemed, was providing the validation he craved. He talked about his business with renewed enthusiasm, blissfully unaware that its current stability was entirely due to my secret interventions. He complained about the cost of living, about taxes, about expenses that were draining him, completely blind to the fact that I was the one absorbing those expenses. His delusion was profound. The day arrived. The air felt charged, electric. I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that was professional, understated. I carried my large tote bag, heavier than usual with the neatly organized files tucked inside. I drove to the cafe, my hands tight on the steering wheel. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But beneath the fear, there was a core of icy calm. This was it, the end of the performance. I saw them through the window as I approached the cafe entrance. They were sitting in a corner booth, heads close together. He was leaning in, talking earnestly, looking vulnerable and charming in his tailored suit, probably paid for by a secret transfer from me, I thought bitterly. Sarah was listening, her expression sympathetic, her hand resting on his arm. The perfect picture of the struggling man and his supportive muse. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The small bell above the door tinkled. Heads turned, but I kept my gaze fixed on their booth. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. Sarah followed his gaze, her smile faltering. I walked towards them, each step deliberate, measured. I didn't run, didn't hesitate. I walked with the quiet purpose of someone who had a job to do. When I reached the table, I didn't sit down. I stood there, looking down at him, then at her. His surprise had morphed into a flicker of unease. Sarah looked confused, maybe a little defensive. "Diana? What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice was tight. I didn't answer him directly. I looked at Sarah.
She was younger than me. Pretty.
Seemingly kind, based on his tearful descriptions. I wondered if she had any idea of the depths of his deception, or if she was just another mark. Hello, Sarah, I said, my voice quiet, steady. Not accusatory, just present. Her eyes widened slightly. She probably didn't even know my name before this. I turned my gaze back to him. He was shifting uncomfortably. He didn't know how much I knew. He thought I was just Diana,
The wife.
the one who didn't understand. John, I said, his name feeling foreign on my tongue. I couldn't help but overhear you the other night, complaining about money, about how difficult things are, about the stress. His face paled. He probably thought I was talking about the conversation I'd overheard through the study door. The one where he cried to Sarah about the mortgage, the payroll, the suppliers. Diana, I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, glancing at Sarah, who was now looking between us with growing alarm. Oh, I think you do, I said softly. I wasn't angry. I was calm.
Deadly calm.
You were talking about the mortgage on the house. The one you couldn't afford. About the payroll for your business.
The one you couldn't make.
About the suppliers threatening legal action. He was speechless. Sarah looked bewildered. You painted such a picture of a man at the end of his rope, I continued, my voice still quiet, but carrying across the small corner of the cafe. Struggling. Fighting against the odds. Burdened. I opened my tote bag. I took out the first file. I placed it on the table in front of him. It was the bank statement for his business account, with highlighted transfers. You were crying to Sarah about not being able to make payroll last month, I said, pointing to a transfer date and amount.
Funny.
Because this transfer here? It covered your entire payroll. Funny because it came from my private account. His eyes flickered from the statement to my face, his jaw slack. Sarah leaned forward, trying to see the paper. I took out another file. You lamented about the mortgage payments, I continued, laying down copies of canceled checks and online transfer confirmations for our mortgage. These last 3 months? All paid by me. From my account. The color drained from his face. He looked like he couldn't breathe. Sarah was staring at the documents, then at him, then back at me. Her initial sympathy was gone, replaced by confusion and suspicion. I pulled out more. Copies of cleared invoices from his biggest client, paid off when he thought he was going to lose them. Receipts for critical business expenses he'd claimed he couldn't cover. Every single one showed a transfer from my accounts. You complained about the cost of this house, I said, gesturing around as if the cafe itself was the house. The house I put the down payment on with my own money. The house I've been quietly keeping afloat while you cried to Sarah about how expensive it is. I took out the final file. Screenshots of his messages with Sarah. The tearful complaints about his finances. The dramatic sighs. The declarations of how difficult his life was. The part where he called me unsupportive, oblivious, living in my own world. I didn't read them aloud. I just slid the papers across the table. Here, I said, my voice flat. Just so you both understand the full context of your little pity party. He stared at the messages, his face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. He probably hadn't expected me to find them. He certainly hadn't expected me to reveal them here, like this. Sarah picked up the message printouts. As she read, her eyes widened. She looked at him, her expression shifting from confusion to disgust. She saw the hypocrisy, the calculated performance, the utter dependence he had hidden from her. He wasn't a struggling hero. He was a fraud, relying on the woman he was betraying to maintain the illusion of competence he showed to his mistress. You lied to me, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, not with sympathy for him, but with anger at being deceived. He looked between us, trapped. The charming, struggling businessman facade had shattered, revealing the pathetic, dependent man underneath. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I reached across the table and gently pushed the stack of financial documents toward Sarah. He was crying about the burning building, I said to her, my gaze steady. He just forgot to mention that I was the one inside, putting out the fire with my bare hands, while he stood outside asking you for a match. He made a sound, a strangled gasp, like he'd been punched in the gut. He clutched at his chest. His face went from pale to ashen. His eyes rolled back slightly. Then, with a choked cry, he slumped forward onto the table, knocking over a sugar dispenser. Sarah recoiled, startled. She looked at him, then at me, then at the documents scattered on the table. The romantic narrative she'd bought into had just imploded. Her struggling hero had just been revealed as a helpless, pathetic liar, reliant on his wife for his very survival. The disgust on her face was palpable. She stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back. She didn't look at him again. She looked at me, a strange mixture of shock and something that might have been grudging respect in her eyes. Then she grabbed her bag and walked away, quickly, without a word. He lay slumped on the table, breathing heavily, eyes closed. Pathetic. The great businessman, the tragic hero, collapsing when faced with the truth of his own dependence. I didn't rush to help him. I didn't call for help. I just stood there, watching him. There was no triumph, not a joyful one. It was cold, quiet satisfaction. The performance was over. The truth was out. He was exposed. I looked around the cafe. A few people were staring, alerted by the noise. I calmly reached for the files I had brought. I didn't need them anymore. I just gathered them, tucked them back into my bag. I glanced at him one last time. This man I had lived with, this man I had secretly supported, this man who had woven a web of lies so intricate he had trapped himself. Then I turned and walked out of the cafe. The bell above the door tinkled again, marking my exit. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. Colder, perhaps, but clean. The performance was over. The stage was empty. The aftermath wasn't a Hollywood ending with sunshine and violins. It was messy, complicated, and emotionally draining. He hadn't actually collapsed in a medical sense, just emotionally. He was humiliated, exposed. The cafe incident, witnessed by others, quickly spread. His business, already on shaky ground, didn't survive the scandal. Clients pulled out, suppliers demanded payment he couldn't make. The house, which I had fought so hard to protect, had to be sold to cover the debts he had accumulated. Even with my efforts, the hole is deeper than I could fill alone in the end. It was a painful loss, losing the home I had invested so much of myself into. But I wasn't left destitute. My own finances were secure, thanks to my foresight and the separate accounts he never knew about. I had protected my career, my savings, my future. The divorce was relatively swift, aided by the overwhelming evidence I possessed. He had no grounds to fight, no secrets left to hide. He was stripped bare, not just financially but reputationally. His public image as the charming, struggling entrepreneur was replaced by the reality of the incompetent, lying cheat. Sarah, I heard through the grapevine, was furious at being caught up in his mess. She disappeared from the scene quickly. The rescuer role hadn't worked out for her. Losing the house hurt more than I expected. It was the physical embodiment of the life I thought we were building, the life I had secretly propped up. Selling it felt like a final act of severing the ties, not just to him, but to the person I had been, the one who believed in the comfortable chair, the shared dream. I moved into a smaller apartment, somewhere that was entirely mine, built on my own foundation. It felt quiet, empty at first. The silence was deafening after years of living with his presence, his noise, his lies. But gradually, the silence began to feel peaceful. A space to breathe. A space to rebuild. There's a coldness that stays with you after something like this. A cynicism about appearances, about charming words, about promises. You learn that the most convincing performances are often the ones hiding the most profound deceptions. You learn that the people who cry loudest about their struggles are sometimes the ones causing them, while relying on the quiet strength of others. But there's also a strength that emerges from the ashes. The knowledge of what I was capable of, the resilience, the strategy, the sheer grit it took to survive and ultimately dismantle the elaborate lie I was trapped in. I faced the fire, I put it out myself, and I walked away, singed but unbroken. I don't regret the way I did it. The quiet, methodical reveal. The moment he collapsed, his carefully constructed world imploding around him. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was calibration. Setting the scales right. Showing him, and the person he sought validation from, the true cost of his deception and the source of the stability he took for granted. He wanted to be the struggling hero? I showed him the reality of his helplessness, an invisible hand that had been saving him. Life now is quieter. Simpler. There's no grand vision I'm secretly supporting, no hidden debts I'm covering. It's just me, building my own life on my own terms. The comfortable chair is gone, but I'm standing on solid ground. Ground I built myself. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.